On the morning of my late wife's memorial, I drove home from the cemetery with white roses still in my hands. But when I reached my front door, my key no longer worked. Two suitcases were waiting on the porch, and a text from my son read, "Dad, stay at a hotel for a few days. The house is getting some renovation work done. Shouldn't take long." Hours later, I learned he had gone to Hawaii with his wife and her family. So I sold the house, packed one bag, and vanished. 5 days later, my phone rang. And for the first time in 60 years, hearing my son's voice sent a chill down my spine. "Thank you for choosing to spend your time here. That's not something I take lightly. Leave a comment. Where are you watching from?" I read every single one. Quick note, this story weaves in fictional elements for storytelling and educational purposes. Any resemblance to names or places is coincidental, but the lesson inside that part is yours to keep. Every October, I make the same drive down Putnam Avenue at dawn. The maple trees along the road have already started turning deep amber and burnt orange, bleeding into one another, like watercolors left out in the rain. Most people see fall in Connecticut and think of apple picking and pumpkin patches and kids in costumes. I see it and think of Eleanor. I pulled into Greenwich Cemetery at just past 6 in the morning, before the groundskeepers arrived, before anyone else had reason to be there. The gravel crunched under my tires the way it always did, and I sat in the car for a moment, before getting out, holding the bouquet of white roses I had stopped to buy on the way. Eleanor always said white roses were honest flowers. They don't try to be anything they're not, Raymond. She used to tell me, trimming the stems over the kitchen sink on Sunday mornings. Just clean and simple and true. 60 years old, and I still cannot walk through that cemetery gate without my chest tightening. Her grave was exactly where it always was, of course, 3rd row. From the old oak tree, the headstone, a modest gray granite we had chosen together 2 years before she passed, because Eleanor had insisted on being practical about it. "I don't want you standing over some enormous marble slab, feeling guilty about the cost," she had said, laughing even then, even when we both knew she was sick. That laugh. Lord, that laugh could fill a room like sunlight through open windows. I crouched down and laid the white roses against the base of the stone. My knees ached the way they always did in cold weather. Now a reminder that the body keeps its own calendar, regardless of what the heart wants. "Happy anniversary of the worst day of my life," I said quietly, and then felt a small, painful smile cross my face. "You always hated when I called it that. You said I should call it the day you went somewhere quieter." I pressed my palm flat against the cold granite. "I'm working on it, sweetheart. I'm still working on it." The morning air smelled like damp earth and wood smoke from somewhere nearby. And for a moment, I could almost smell Eleanor's kitchen sourdough bread rising on the counter, a little rosemary tucked into the dough, the way her mother had taught her coffee brewing, dark and strong. She made bread every Sunday morning for 31 years. The whole house smelled like warmth. I did not understand until she was gone how much of the warmth in that house had been her and not the bread at all. "Raymond," I looked up. Pastor William Greer was walking toward me from the far end of the cemetery path, his coat collar turned up against the chill, his breath making small clouds in the cold air. William was 63, 2 years my senior, with the kind of steady eyes that had seen enough grief in his years of ministry that nothing surprised him anymore. He had presided over Eleanor's service. He had sat with me afterward in the church kitchen for 3 hours, while I drank bad coffee and stared at the wall and did not say a single word, and he had not once tried to fill the silence with scripture or comfort. He had just stayed. That had meant everything. "Didn't expect to see you here this early," he said, stopping beside me and looking down at the grave with the same quiet respect he always showed. "Couldn't sleep," I said, standing slowly, one hand bracing against my knee. William nodded. "How are you holding up? Truly not the answer you give people at church. The real one. I looked at Eleanor's name carved into the granite and felt my throat tighten. Some days are easier than others, I said. Today is not one of the easier ones. He put a hand briefly on my shoulder. Mitchell coming by later, something shifted in my chest when he said my son's name, though I could not have explained exactly why at that moment. A small unease, the way the air changes just before a storm rolls in when the sky looks perfectly fine, but something in your bones knows better. He said he'd be around, I said. William studied my face for a moment, then gave my shoulder one firm squeeze before letting go. You know where I am if you need me, he said simply. I drove home along Putnam Avenue, the same way I had come, the white gold morning light, cutting low through the maple trees and throwing long shadows across the road. I had lived in the same house on Meadow Lane for 22 years, bought it with Eleanor when Mitchell was still in elementary school. We had repainted the shutters 3 times. Eleanor had planted roses along the front walk that first spring, deep red ones that came back faithfully every year without being asked. I turned onto Meadow Lane and felt the usual small ease of returning to a familiar place. The neighborhood was still quiet, just a few lights on in windows, someone walking a dog at the far end of the block. I pulled into the driveway and reached into my jacket pocket for my keys. I found them, walked to the front door, and pressed the key against the lock. The lock did not recognize it. I tried again more carefully this time, making sure the key was fully seated. The electronic panel beeped 3 times in flat mechanical succession, and a small red light blinked at me like an accusation. I pulled the key out and stared at it, turning it over in my fingers. It was the same key I had carried for 22 years. The same key I had held in my hand at Eleanor's bedside the last night she was conscious, when she had reached up and touched my wrist and said, "Go home and sleep, Raymond. I'll be here in the morning." She had not been there in the morning, and now my own key would not open my own front door. I took one step back, and that was when I saw them. 2 suitcases and a duffel bag stacked neatly against the porch railing. My suitcases, my duffel bag, set outside like luggage waiting for a hotel porter. My heart did not pound, my hands did not shake. Instead, a strange, cold clarity settled over me, the way shock sometimes arrives, not as chaos, but as sudden, terrible stillness. I reached into my pocket and took out my phone. It was already lit up with a text message from Mitchell. The message from Mitchell read, "Dad, stay at a hotel for a few days. The house is getting some renovation work done. Shouldn't take long." I read it twice, then a third time. The words were perfectly ordinary, the kind of message a considerate son might send a father who was about to be inconvenienced by contractors and dust sheets, except that I had not been told about any renovation, except that there was no smell of fresh paint, no construction equipment in the driveway, no notice taped to the door from a contractor, except that it was the 14th of October, the day I drove to Greenwich Cemetery every single year, and Mitchell knew that better than anyone. My thumb hovered over his name in my contacts. I pressed call. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. "Mitchell, it's your father. I'm standing outside the house and the lock code isn't working. Call me back." I tried again. Voicemail. A third time. The same. I lowered the phone and stood on the front porch of my own home of 22 years, looking at my 2 suitcases propped against the railing. Someone had packed them. The zipper on the larger one was slightly off track, the way it always was when you packed in a hurry. My brown leather overnight bag was there too, the one Eleanor had given me for our 20th anniversary. The one with my initials stamped on the front pocket in gold letters that had mostly worn off now. The door to the house next to ours opened, and Dorothea Finch stepped out onto her porch. Dorothea was 71 years old, a retired schoolteacher who had lived on Meadow Lane for longer than Eleanor and I had. She was the kind of neighbor who remembered your wife's birthday and left a card in the mailbox, who noticed when your newspaper hadn't been picked up and knocked to check on you. She had brought 3 casseroles to the house in the week after Eleanor's funeral, and had not once overstayed her welcome. She was in the truest sense of the phrase a good woman. She saw me standing on the porch with my luggage around me, and her face did something complicated. A quick flash of recognition, then discomfort, then a decision. "Raymond," she said carefully, coming down her porch steps toward the low hedge between our properties. "You're back. Seems the lock's been changed," I said, keeping my voice even. Dorothea pressed her lips together. She had the look of someone who had been sitting on something uncomfortable and was finally being given permission to put it down. She pulled her phone from her cardigan pocket, tapped at the screen for a moment, then held it out to me over the hedge. "I saw them leaving yesterday morning," she said quietly. "Early. I was getting the paper. I didn't know what to make of it, Raymond, so I took a picture. I thought maybe I was wrong about what I was seeing." I took the phone from her hand. The photograph was time-stamped the previous morning at 6:47 a.m. It showed the front of my house, the driveway, and the street beyond. Mitchell was there wearing a jacket I had bought him 2 Christmases ago. Vanessa, his wife, stood beside him in sunglasses and a cream-colored coat, her carry-on bag at her feet. And Gloria Holt, Vanessa's mother, a woman who had never once thanked me for the 3 years I had paid for the catering at her church fundraisers, because Vanessa had asked me to. Gloria was there too, laughing at something, her hand on a large suitcase covered in a bright floral pattern. They were not loading renovation materials. They were loading themselves into a black SUV that was already waiting at the curb, all of them smiling. Mitchell had his arm around Vanessa's shoulders. Gloria was already reaching for her phone to take a selfie. I stood there on the porch and looked at that photograph for a long time. My eyes moved from face to face, and something inside me, something I had been quietly ignoring for longer than I wanted to admit, cracked open like old timber giving way under weight. It was never meant to carry alone. It was the date that undid me. Not the locked door, not the suitcases. The date. Eleanor had been gone for 3 years, and in 3 years I had never missed a single October 14th at that cemetery. Mitchell knew. He had stood beside me at that grave 2 years running, his hand briefly on my back, saying the right things. He knew what day it was. He had chosen it anyway. My hands had started to tremble very slightly, the way they sometimes did now, when I was trying to hold too much together at once. I handed the phone back to Dorothea. "Do you know where they went?" My voice came out steadier than I felt. She hesitated. "I heard Gloria say something about Hawaii when they were loading the bags. 5 days, she said." Dorothea was looking at me with an expression I recognized, the same expression Pastor Greer had worn in the cemetery that morning. That careful, watchful concern of someone who cares enough to tell you the truth, but is not sure how much of the truth you can hold right now. I looked back at my front door, then down at Eleanor's roses along the walk, still holding a few late-blooming red flowers despite the October chill, stubborn and faithful as she had always been. I was still carrying the bouquet of white roses I had brought home from the cemetery. I had forgotten I was holding them. I looked down at them now, white roses Eleanor had always called honest flowers. And then I walked to the front door one more time, crouched down and laid them on the welcome mat. Not for Mitchell, not for myself, just because they deserved better than my hand, which had gone cold. Then I straightened up, picked up my overnight bag, left the 2 suitcases where they were, and walked to my car. I did not look back at the house. I could not afford to, not yet. Because if I had turned around and seen those white roses lying on the mat in front of a door that would not open for me, I was not certain I could have kept myself together long enough to do what I already knew I needed to do. And I had things to do. The motel on the post road cost $47 a night. The carpet was the color of old mustard. The heater made a sound like someone clearing their throat every few minutes. And the bathroom mirror had a crack running diagonally from corner to corner that split my reflection into 2 slightly misaligned halves. I stood in front of that mirror for a moment, After I checked in, looking at my own face, the lines around my eyes deeper than I remembered, the gray at my temples, having long since taken over entirely. And I thought, 60 years old, and you are standing in a $47 motel room on the night of your wife's Memorial Day because your son changed the locks while you were putting flowers on her grave. I sat on the edge of the bed and put my overnight bag down beside me. The room smelled like industrial cleaner and the faint ghost of someone else's cigarette smoke. I had paid 47 times more than this for Mitchell's first semester textbooks alone. I had paid more than this for the deposit on his first apartment, for the suit he wore to his first job interview, for the rehearsal dinner when he married Vanessa. I was not thinking about those things to feel sorry for myself. I was thinking about them because the math of a life has a way of becoming very clear when you are sitting alone in a room that costs $47 a night. I reached into my overnight bag and took out the wooden box. I brought it everywhere. Eleanor had given it to me herself, pressing it into my hands one afternoon, about 8 months before she passed, when she was still well enough to sit at the kitchen table but tired enough that she needed to rest between sentences. "Keep this with you," she had said, her fingers folding over mine around the box. "Not because you'll need what's inside right away, but because the day will come when you will, and I want you to have it close." I had not asked her what she meant. I had learned in 31 years of marriage that Eleanor Calloway said exactly what she meant, and meant exactly what she said, and that the worst thing you could do was push her to explain herself before she was ready. The box contained the usual things: a photograph of us from our honeymoon in Savannah, the small pearl earrings she had worn on our wedding day, a folded note from Mitchell's 8th grade teacher, saying he was a gifted student with great potential. That note made my chest ache in a way that was different from grief. More complicated, and at the very bottom, beneath everything else, a sealed white envelope. On the front, in Eleanor's careful handwriting, for Raymond. "Open only if the day comes." My hands were not entirely steady as I broke the seal. The letter was 3 pages, written in the same neat cursive Eleanor used for everything, the pen pressed firmly into the paper, the way she always wrote, like she wanted the words to leave a mark that lasted. She had written it, she explained in the first paragraph, 2 years before she passed, long before we knew how little time was left, but not long after she had begun to notice things about Mitchell that quietly frightened her. Small things at first. The way he spoke about the house as though it were already his. The way he had started referring to our savings in conversations with Vanessa as what we'll have when things sort themselves out. The way he looked at Eleanor's jewelry once when he thought no one was watching, with an expression she described as the same face he made at Christmas as a little boy calculating what was his. "I don't write this to condemn him," Eleanor had written. "He is our son, and I love him without condition. But I write it because I know you, Raymond. I know that you will want to believe the best of him long past the point where the evidence has stopped supporting it. You will forgive him 3 times before you let yourself see clearly. That is one of the finest things about you. It is also the thing that will hurt you most." I had to stop reading for a moment. My eyes had gone hot, and my throat had closed around something that felt like it wanted to become a sound but couldn't find its way out. I pressed the heel of my hand against my mouth and breathed through my nose until the feeling passed enough to continue. Eleanor had attached the property documents to the letter. The deed to the house on Meadow Lane, held jointly between Raymond Arthur Calloway and Eleanor May Calloway under joint tenancy with right of survivorship. A form of ownership she had noted in the margin in her practical way, which meant that when one spouse passed, full ownership transferred automatically and entirely to the surviving spouse. No probate, no dispute. Mitchell's name appeared nowhere on that deed, not as owner, not as beneficiary, not in any capacity whatsoever. She had also attached her will, notarized and witnessed, signed 3 years before her death, leaving all assets to me without exception. The last paragraph of the letter was short. If they ever lock you out of your own home, Raymond and I pray they don't. But if they do, don't beg to be let back in. Don't fight for the walls and the carpet and the shutters we painted together. Walk away from all of it. Build something they can never take from you, because it will be built from who you are and not from what you own. I already made sure of that. I love you. I have always loved you. Go be the man I married. I folded the letter very carefully along its original creases and held it in both hands for a long moment, looking at Eleanor's handwriting on the outside of the envelope. My eyes were burning badly now, and I let them. There was no one here to see, and Eleanor had always said that a man who refuses to cry is just a man who refuses to feel, and she had never had much patience for that. You knew, I said to the empty room, my voice rough. You knew this was coming, and you sat across from me at that kitchen table every single morning, and you never let me see how worried you were. I stopped, swallowed hard. I'm sorry I didn't see it myself. I'm sorry I made you carry that alone. I reached into the box one more time, and my fingers found something I had not noticed before, tucked flat against the bottom beneath the documents. A small notebook with a faded blue cover, its spine slightly cracked from use. I opened it. Page 1 in Eleanor's handwriting. Sourdough for a lonely morning. Below it, a recipe written out in full with small margin notes in different colored pens added over what looked like years. At the bottom of the page, a note dated 6 months before she passed. Raymond, this one is for you, not for company. Make it when you need to remember that good things take time and cannot be rushed. I sat on the edge of that $47 bed and held my wife's recipe book against my chest, and for the first time since I had pulled into my own driveway and found myself locked out of my own life, I let myself cry. Not quietly, not with dignity, the kind of crying that comes from somewhere deep and old and has been waiting a long time for permission. When it was over, I felt hollowed out, but steadier. I picked up my phone and called Pastor William Greer. It was past 11 o'clock at night. He picked up on the second ring. Raymond, she knew William. I said, my voice still rough at the edges. She always knew. She left me everything I need. A pause. Then quietly, what are you going to do? I looked at the documents spread across the bedspread, at Eleanor's name on the deed, at her handwriting, on the recipe book in my lap. First thing in the morning, I said, I'm going to call Sterling Vance. Sterling Vance picked up on the second ring, which told me something important, before he had said a single word. Men like Sterling partners at Manhattan family law firms, with offices on the 41st floor of a building on Park Avenue, and a client list that read like a Connecticut social register, did not pick up unknown calls at 7 in the morning unless they were expecting them. Raymond, he said, and his voice carried the particular quality of someone who had been half waiting for this conversation for a while. Sterling Vance was 61 years old, lean and precise in the way of men who had spent 4 decades choosing every word carefully before they spent it. Eleanor had found him 12 years ago when she needed help updating her will after her mother passed, and she had trusted him completely from the first meeting. He doesn't perform, she had told me afterward. He just tells you exactly what is true, even when it's uncomfortable. That's rare. She had gone back to him 3 years before her death to finalize everything. I had not known at the time exactly how much she had finalized. I told him everything. I sat on the edge of that motel bed in the gray October morning light and laid it all out. The locked door, the suitcases on the porch, Dorothea's photograph, Mitchell's text message, the envelope Eleanor had left, the deed, the will. Sterling listened without interrupting, which was another thing I appreciated about him. He did not make the sounds people make when they want you to know they are listening. He simply listened. When I finished, there was a brief pause. Eleanor brought me the updated will and the property documents 3 years ago, he said. She asked me to keep a certified copy in our safe. She said, and I am quoting her directly, that she hoped I would never need to use them, but that if I did, she wanted everything in order. Another pause, shorter this time. She was a remarkable woman, Raymond. My throat tightened. Yes, I said. She was. Sterling moved quickly, then the way good attorneys do when the facts are clean and the path is clear. He confirmed what Eleanor had explained in her letter. Under Connecticut law, the house on Meadow Lane had been held in joint tenancy with right of survivorship. This meant that when Eleanor passed, full legal ownership had transferred to me automatically and completely, no court process required, no probate, no dispute possible. Mitchell's name had never appeared on the deed in any capacity. He had no ownership interest, no legal claim, and no standing to challenge a sale. What about the will? I asked. Notarized, witnessed by 2 independent parties, filed with this office. Airtight, Sterling said. He could challenge it, but he would not win. Eleanor was thorough. She always was. I want to sell the house, I said. The words came out steadier than I expected. I anticipated that, Sterling said. I took the liberty of reaching out to a colleague yesterday evening, after you called Pastor Greer. William called me Raymond, because he was worried about you and thought you might need counsel sooner rather than later. There was no judgment in his voice, only efficiency. I have a buyer who can move immediately. His name is Conrad Hawthorne. Conrad Hawthorne, Sterling explained, was a 55-year-old real estate investor based in Westport, who specialized in purchasing residential properties for cash with rapid closings. He had reviewed the preliminary documents Sterling had sent the previous evening and was prepared to offer $2.1 million with an escrow closing within 48 hours. The house had been appraised at $2.4 million the previous spring, but the speed and certainty of a cash sale, Sterling noted, had its own significant value. Tell him yes, I said. Sterling made a sound that might have been the closest he came to expressing satisfaction. There is one more matter, he said. Before we transfer possession to Mr. Hawthorne, I strongly recommend we compile a formal inventory of your personal property inside the house, every item you intend to remove documented and signed before the closing. This protects you against any future claim that you removed property belonging to the marital home. Do it, I said. And Raymond, I want to file a restraining order on Mr. Hawthorne's behalf simultaneously with the closing paperwork. I asked him to explain. Sterling did so in the direct way he had once. Conrad Hawthorne became the legal owner of the property. Any attempt by Mitchell or members of his family to enter the premises, harass the new owner, or interfere with his possession of the property would constitute a violation of that order. A criminal matter, not merely a civil one. It would give law enforcement clear authority to act if Mitchell showed up and caused trouble, which Sterling considered a reasonable probability. He's going to be very angry, I said. Yes, Sterling agreed, which is precisely why we file the order before he gets home. I exhaled slowly. Outside the motel window, the October sky was the pale, washed-out blue of early morning, and a single crow was sitting on the telephone wire across the post road, looking at nothing in particular, with the serene indifference of a creature that had no mortgage, no son, and no complicated feelings about any of it. Sterling, I said, Eleanor told me once that she hired you because you tell the truth even when it's uncomfortable. So tell me something true right now. A pause. The law is entirely on your side, he said. Mitchell has no legal claim to that property. None. What he did, choosing the day of his mother's memorial to lock you out of your own home, that may say a great deal about who he is, but it does not create a legal right where none exists. I nodded, though he could not see me. That's the truth, I said. That is the truth, he confirmed. We met in his office that afternoon. Sterling had Conrad Hawthorne there in person, a broad-shouldered man with a firm handshake, and the economical manner of someone who had bought and sold enough properties that the transaction itself held no drama for him. He reviewed the documents, asked 3 precise questions, and signed where Sterling indicated. I signed where Sterling indicated. The restraining order application was filed with the Greenwich Superior Court the same afternoon, citing Conrad Hawthorne as the protected party against harassment or trespass by Mitchell James Calloway or any member of his household. Sterling set his pen down and looked at me across the mahogany desk. From this moment, he said, the property at 14 Meadow Lane, Greenwich, Connecticut, belongs to Mr. Conrad Hawthorne. I looked at my own signature on the closing documents at Eleanor's name on the deed beside mine for the last time, and I felt something shift inside my chest. Not relief exactly, and not grief exactly, but something that lived in the space between the two. A door closing. Not the one on Meadow Lane. A different kind. Then Sterling slid one more envelope across the desk toward me. Small white, sealed. My name on the front in Eleanor's handwriting. She left this with me when she finalized the will, Sterling said. She told me to give it to you if this day ever came. She said you would know when to open it. I picked it up and held it without opening it. The paper was slightly thicker than ordinary envelope paper, the kind Eleanor always bought, because she said cheap stationery was a false economy. I put it in my jacket pocket next to my heart and stood up. I gave myself 2 hours. That was the number I had arrived at somewhere between leaving Sterling's office and pulling into the Bank of America parking lot on Greenwich Avenue the following morning. 2 hours to close every financial door I had ever opened for Mitchell Calloway. It seemed both too long and not nearly long enough, but it was what I had, and I have always believed that a man who cannot work within his limits has not yet understood them. The branch manager at Bank of America was a young woman named Patricia, who wore her hair in a neat bun and had the careful, pleasant manner of someone trained to deliver difficult news without causing scenes. I told her I needed to remove Mitchell as an authorized user on my personal checking account and close the associated supplementary access immediately. She asked for my identification, typed several things, and then looked up at me with an expression that was professionally neutral, but not quite successfully so. Mr. Calloway, I do want to confirm, once we remove the authorized user and close supplementary access, any cards issued under that access will be declined immediately. I understand, I said. And you're certain you want to proceed? I looked at her steadily. I am entirely certain. It took 11 minutes. I had been opening and managing accounts at that branch for 19 years, and it took 11 minutes to undo what I had set up for Mitchell when he was 22 years old and just starting out and needed a safety net. I had thought of it as a safety net. I understood now that he had thought of it as something rather different. From the bank, I drove to the Chase branch 2 blocks north and called their customer service line from the parking lot, rather than going inside because the call was faster. Mitchell had a supplementary credit card on my Chase account I had added him 4 years ago, when he said he was having a difficult quarter with his business. I reported the card as lost, requested immediate cancellation, and was done in 8 minutes. The representative read me a confirmation number that I wrote on the back of a gas station receipt and then folded into my breast pocket. Next, I drove to the Toyota dealership on West Putnam Avenue, where I had bought my car 3 years earlier. The sales manager there, a heavy-set man named Gerald, who remembered me from the original purchase, looked genuinely startled when I told him I wanted to sell it back on the spot. I told him I was relocating and needed to travel light. He offered me $18,000, which was several thousand below market, but was cash in hand by noon, and I accepted without negotiating, because I did not have time to negotiate, and because the number did not matter the way it once might have. I took a cab from the dealership to Dorothea's house. She opened the door before I could knock, which told me she had been watching for me. She was holding a dish towel, which she twisted in her hands, the way people do when they are worried and trying not to show it. "Raymond," she said. Her eyes moved over my face, and whatever she saw there made her press her lips together tightly. "Come in." "I can't stay," I said. "I need to ask you something." She nodded immediately, the dish towel going still. When Mitchell comes home, and he will come home in a few days, there will be an envelope waiting for him. I need you to hold it and give it to him when he arrives. Not before. Not to Vanessa. Not to Gloria. Only to Mitchell, only when he is standing in front of the house. I took the envelope from my jacket. I had written Mitchell's name on the front, in the same plain block letters I had used for 30 years, on birthday cards and Christmas envelopes, and the notes I used to leave in his school lunch, when he was small enough that he still thought that was something to look forward to. Can you do that for me? Dorothea took the envelope with both hands. Her eyes had gone bright and slightly wet. Of course I can, she said. Then quietly, where are you going? Portland, I said. She blinked. Oregon. Eleanor always said the Pacific Northwest had decent bread. I said, which was not entirely true, but was not entirely untrue either, and Dorothea seemed to understand that what I was really saying was that I needed to go somewhere that held none of this, none of the 22 years of Meadow Lane and October anniversaries, and a lock that no longer knew my key. Dorothea reached out and put her hand on my arm briefly, firmly, the way a person does when words are not sufficient, but presence still means something. Her eyes were wet now, and she was not trying to hide it. She would be proud of you, Dorothea said. Eleanor. She would be so proud. My jaw tightened. I covered her hand with mine for a moment, just a moment, and then I stepped back. Water the roses if you get a chance, I said. The red ones along the front walk. They'll need it before the frost comes. Dorothea nodded, not trusting herself to speak. I walked to the cab waiting at the curb, put my overnight bag and Eleanor's recipe book on the seat beside me and asked the driver to take me to the Greyhound station on Millbank Avenue. The bus to Portland left at 2:15 in the afternoon. It was a long route, 2 days with connections through New York and Chicago, and then northwest across the country, and I had chosen it deliberately. I could have flown. I could have been in Portland by evening. But I needed the time. I needed to sit with the particular silence that comes after a major decision, the silence that is not empty, but full of everything you have just set down, and let it settle before I arrived somewhere new and had to begin being a person again. I found a window seat near the back. The bus pulled out of Greenwich at 2:17, 2 minutes behind schedule, and I watched the town I had lived in for 22 years slide past the window, the post road, the library, the turn onto Putnam Avenue that led to the cemetery, the whole quiet, familiar geography of a life I was leaving. I opened Eleanor's recipe book to the first page. I did not read the words she had written there. I had them memorized by now. I just looked at her handwriting for a moment, the way the ink had faded slightly at the edges, and felt the particular steadiness that came from knowing someone had believed in you long before you believed in yourself. I read those words 3 times. Then I looked out the window at the Connecticut countryside moving past the maples blazing amber and gold in the October afternoon light. And I let myself feel all of it, the grief and the anger, and the strange, frightening freedom of a man who has nothing left to protect except himself. Somewhere in Hawaii, a phone was buzzing on a nightstand. Mitchell would be at dinner by now, laughing at something, his arm around Vanessa Gloria, ordering another round. The card he reached for would not work. He would assume it was a glitch. He would try again. He would still assume it was a glitch. For now, I had been in Portland for 3 days when Dorothea called. It was early evening, and I was sitting on the floor of a small, empty room above a hardware store on Northwest Hoyt Street that I had rented by the week, eating a sandwich I had bought from a deli 2 blocks over, and reading through Eleanor's recipe book for what was probably the 4th time. Portland in October had a particular quality of light in the evenings, softer than Connecticut, filtered through clouds that never quite committed to rain, but never entirely went away either. I had found it unexpectedly comforting. My phone lit up with Dorothea's name, and I picked up immediately. Raymond. Her voice was careful in the way it had been when she handed me the photograph over the hedge. The voice of someone about to describe something they wished they had not witnessed. "Tell me," I said. She took a breath. "They came back this afternoon. Mitchell and Vanessa and Gloria. The car pulled up around 3 o'clock, one of those big black SUVs from the airport. They were laughing when they got out Raymond. All three of them. Gloria had so many shopping bags she could barely carry them. He looked like a man coming home from the best week of his life. I set my sandwich down on the floor beside me. Outside the window, a light rain had begun tapping softly against the glass. Mitchell went to the door first, Dorothea continued. He was still smiling when he put the key in, and then... She paused. The smile just left his face, like someone turned off a switch. He tried again, then again. Vanessa said something to him, and he held up his hand to stop her. He tried the old code on the keypad. Nothing. And then Conrad opened the door, I said. Yes, he opened it and just stood there looking at them. Big man, very calm. He said, "Can I help you?" Just like that, like they were strangers on the street. Dorothea's voice had taken on a slightly breathless quality, the way people sound when they are reliving something that surprised even them. Mitchell said the house was his. Conrad said very quietly, Raymond, very quietly. He said, "I have the deed. Would you like to see it?" Don't. I pressed my back against the wall and looked at the ceiling of my rented room. Gloria started yelling, Dorothea said. She was screaming that it was her daughter's house, that Mitchell had been robbed, that someone had stolen everything. Conrad just stood in the doorway and did not raise his voice once. He pointed to the restraining order notice that Sterling had posted beside the front door. It had been served that morning, and he said that if any of them remained on the property or continued to interfere with his possession of it, he would call law enforcement, and they would be subject to criminal charges for violating the order. I knew about restraining orders well enough, but for anyone listening who might not. A restraining order once granted by a court is a legally enforceable document. Violating it by trespassing on the protected party's property or harassing them is not a civil matter, but a criminal one, meaning police can arrest the violating party on the spot without a separate warrant. Sterling had made sure the order was served and posted before Mitchell's flight landed. Mitchell's face went white, Dorothea said. Not angry white, the other kind. The kind where a person suddenly understands that something is real. She paused. That was when I walked over with the envelope. How did he take it? He read it standing right there on the sidewalk. Vanessa was trying to read over his shoulder, and he turned away from her. Dorothea's voice dropped slightly. Raymond. I was watching his face when he read it. I don't know what you wrote in that letter, but whatever it was, his chin started shaking. He pressed his mouth together very hard, and his eyes went red, and he just stood there on the sidewalk outside the house he thought was his, holding that piece of paper. Something tightened behind my sternum. Not satisfaction. I want to be precise about that because it would be easy to mistake what I felt in that moment for satisfaction, and it was not that. It was something heavier and older and sadder than satisfaction. It was the feeling of a man watching a consequence arrive that he had hoped for 30 years would never be necessary. The officer came about 10 minutes after that, Dorothea said. Someone must have called about the noise. Gloria was still going. She did not stop for a long time. The officer, young fellow, Danny Pratt, he lives on the next street over. I know his mother. He came and spoke to Mitchell very calmly. He had a copy of the restraining order. He told Mitchell that Conrad Hawthorne was the legal owner of the property, that the sale had been properly recorded with the town, and that continued presence on the premises would constitute a criminal violation. Did Mitchell argue? He tried. He said there must have been a mistake, that he had rights as a family member that someone needed to investigate. Dorothea made a small sound that was not quite a laugh. Officer Pratt told him that family relationships do not create property rights, and that if he believed a fraud had occurred, he was welcome to consult an attorney, but that right now he needed to move back from the property line. I exhaled slowly, and then Mitchell's phone rang, Dorothea said. He looked at the screen and whatever he saw on it, his face just collapsed, Raymond. He went from arguing with the officer to just standing there like the air had gone out of him. Vanessa grabbed his arm and asked what was wrong, and he said, "I heard this clearly. I was only a few feet away," he said. "The bank, the collateral." And he didn't say anything else. The loan. $380,000 Mitchell had borrowed against the house as collateral for his business. A house that was no longer his, had never legally been his, and which a bank's lien department would have discovered upon the recorded title transfer to Conrad Hawthorne, was no longer available as security for any debt. Gloria sat down on the curb, Dorothea said quietly. Just sat right down on the concrete in her good coat, with all her shopping bags around her, and put her face in her hands. I looked out at the Portland rain, which had gotten slightly heavier. "Dorothea," I said, "are you all right?" That was a lot to witness. "I'm fine," she said, and then immediately contradicted herself by clearing her throat in the way she did when she was trying not to cry. "Raymond, your son sat down on the sidewalk next to his mother-in-law. Not because he was tired. He just sat down, like his legs decided for him." I closed my eyes. "Is the rose bush still there?" I asked. "Eleanor's roses on the front walk." A pause. "Yes," Dorothea said, her voice steadying slightly at the change of subject. "Still blooming, Raymond. A few of them even this late in the season." "Good," I said. I ended the call and sat for a moment with the phone in my hand and the Portland rain against the window and Eleanor's recipe book open in my lap to a page about patience, and I let myself feel all of the complicated, contradictory weight of that word father for as long as I needed to. Then I closed the book, stood up, and began to think about bread. The morning after Dorothea's call, I walked. Portland is a city that rewards walking in a way that Greenwich never quite did. Greenwich had beautiful streets, but they were the kind of beautiful that kept a certain distance manicured and composed, like a room arranged for company. Portland's streets felt lived in. Northwest 23rd Avenue had the slightly mismatched quality of a place that had grown organically rather than been planned coffee shops wedged between bookstores, small restaurants with handwritten menus, all of it under a sky that had settled comfortably somewhere between gray and silver. I had an address on my phone, a small ground floor space previously, a flower shop vacant 4 months available for $3,200 a month. I had looked at the photographs a long time the night before. I found it between a wine bar and a dry cleaner, its front window papered over a "For Lease" sign taped in the corner. I stood on the sidewalk for a while. The city moved around me, indifferent and alive, and I thought, this is a place where a person could begin something. The property manager, Sandra, met me within the hour. She unlocked the door and stepped back. The space smelled like old wood, and the faint ghost of cut flowers, roses, I thought, and felt something move in my chest at that. The brickback wall was exactly as it had looked in the photographs. The hardwood floor was worn in the middle solid at the edges. The small back kitchen had a gas hookup still active. "I'll take it," I said. Sandra looked up from her clipboard. "You haven't asked about the lease terms." 12 months with option to renew," I said. "First and last month's deposit. Possession by end of the week." She studied me for a moment, assessing whether I was decisive or reckless. Whatever she concluded, she wrote something down and said, "I'll have the paperwork ready tomorrow." I was measuring the back wall when the front door opened. A broad-shouldered man in his mid-40s stepped in holding a folded piece of paper. Thick-knuckled hands, calloused palms. The hands of someone who had worked with them for a long time. "I'm a baker," he said simply. "Heard the space was taken, hoping you might need staff." His name was Hector Ruiz, 44 years old. 20 years in professional kitchens across the Pacific Northwest, most recently at an artisan bakery on SE Division Street that had closed when the owner retired. He had his certifications, his references, and his grandmother's pan dulce recipe committed to memory. "What kind of bread are you planning to make?" he asked, already eyeing the kitchen, with the calculating look of someone measuring oven placement in his head. "Sourdough to start," I said. "My wife's recipe." Something in my voice must have told him not to ask about the wife in the present tense, because he didn't. Instead, he looked at me steadily and said, "Sourdough is the most honest bread there is. Takes patience. Can't be rushed. Every good thing starts with flour, water, salt, and patience." Eleanor's words, first page of her recipe book. "You're hired," I said. "Tomorrow. Bring your grandmother's pan dulce recipe." He grinned wide, unguarded, the smile of a man who genuinely loves what he does. I had not seen anyone smile like that in a very long time. The next morning, while Hector and I hauled out the old counter, an elderly woman stepped carefully through the open door. Small, upright white hair, cut short, eyes that missed very little. She carried a canvas tote from Powell's books. "What are you putting here?" she asked, looking around with open curiosity and no embarrassment whatsoever about walking into a construction zone. "A bakery," I said. "My wife's recipes." "What's it going to be called?" I looked at Hector. He set down his end of the counter and waited. "Eleanor's Bakehouse," I said. The woman, Nora Bates, retired librarian, 4 blocks north on Northwest Overton, widowed 11 years, nodded slowly as though the name confirmed something she had already suspected. "She must have been a wonderful woman," Nora said. "She was," I said. "She really was." That evening I sat on an overturned crate in the back kitchen and opened Eleanor's recipe book. I picked up a pencil and wrote in the margin beneath her words and a reason to get up in the morning. Then Warren's message came through. "Raymond, Mitchell just retained an attorney in Hartford, filing motion to challenge the property sale, claiming mental incapacity. You should know." I set the phone face down on the crate and looked at the brick wall for a long moment. "All right, Eleanor," I said quietly. "Round 2. Sterling called on a Tuesday morning while I was on my knees sanding the base of the new front counter. I had sawdust on my hands and a bruise forming on my left shin from where I had walked into a low shelf the previous afternoon, and I had not slept particularly well because the upstairs neighbor in my rented room had a dog that apparently kept its own schedule. None of that mattered much. There is something clarifying about physical work when your mind is full of things it cannot yet resolve. The body asks for your attention, and the mind, grateful for the excuse, quiets down. I answered on the second ring. "Raymond," Sterling said, "Mitchell has filed a motion to void contract based on mental incapacity. I received the paperwork from the Hartford court this morning." I sat back on my heels and set down the sandpaper. In the United States, a person can challenge a property sale by arguing that at the time of signing, they lacked the mental capacity to understand what they were doing. Mitchell's attorney was attempting to use it as a weapon, arguing that grief and disorientation following Eleanor's memorial had impaired my judgment when I signed the closing documents with Conrad Hawthorne. "He's claiming grief made me incompetent," I said. "His attorney is making that argument, yes," Sterling said. "It is not a strong argument. You retained counsel, compiled documents, negotiated terms, and completed a transaction within 48 hours of the alleged incapacity, all of which suggests considerable clarity of mind. But we cannot ignore it. We need a formal neuropsychological assessment submitted to the court as evidence of your competency." I looked across the half-finished bakery at Hector, who was measuring the back wall for shelving and pretending not to listen. He was not entirely succeeding. "I know someone," I said. Dr. Patricia Owens maintained a private practice in clinical neuropsychology 7 blocks from the bakery. I had first encountered her 3 weeks earlier when she had peered through the papered front window and called out, "What's going in here?" She had the frank curiosity of someone who considered the neighborhood her personal jurisdiction. I called her from the back of the bakery, while Hector hammered shelving brackets with diplomatic loudness to give me privacy. "Dr. Owens," I said, "I need to ask you something outside the scope of sidewalk conversation." She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said, "I want to be clear about something, Raymond. I will conduct this assessment with complete professional objectivity. If I find anything that gives me clinical concern, I will report it accurately, regardless of what you need for your case. You understand that?" "I wouldn't want it any other way," I said. "Good," she said. "I have a cancellation Thursday morning. Come in at 9. Bring whatever medical records you have from your primary care physician in Connecticut. It will save us time." The assessment took 3 sessions across 2 weeks. On the final day, she folded her hands on her desk and looked at me steadily. "You were grieving," she said. "Significantly stressed. Anyone who tells you otherwise would be lying. But grief does not constitute mental incapacity unless it rises to a level that impairs the ability to understand the nature of one's actions." She paused. "You understood exactly what you were doing. That is what the assessment shows, and that is what I will testify to." Something in my chest loosened that I had not realized was tight. Sterling filed the response with the Hartford court the following week, Dr. Owens's assessment. Eleanor's notarized will the full documented timeline of the sale. He called me the afternoon the ruling came back. "Motion denied with prejudice," Sterling said, and I could hear quiet satisfaction in his carefully controlled voice. The judge's words were, "This motion appears to be a bad faith attempt to circumvent a legally sound transaction executed by a man in full possession of his faculties." I was standing at this front window watching the afternoon foot traffic on Northwest 23rd, people with coffee cups and dogs living their ordinary Portland lives in the gray November light. Hector was watching me from behind the counter. "Good news?" he asked. "One battle down," I said. Hector exhaled and let himself smile. "How many left?" I looked out at the Portland sky, deep gray, the color of patience. "Enough," I said, "but fewer than before." I woke up at 4 in the morning and lay there for approximately 45 seconds before accepting that sleep was finished for the day. The room above the hardware store on Northwest Hoyt was dark and quiet. The only sound, the distant hiss of early traffic on Burnside, and the occasional creak of the old building settling into the cold. December had arrived in Portland, the way it always did in the Pacific Northwest, not with the dramatic snowfalls of the Northeast, but with a deepening of the gray, a lowering of the sky, a kind of committed dampness that got into your coat and stayed there. I had grown up with Connecticut winters. Portland's version felt gentler, like an argument conducted in library voices rather than across a fence. I dressed in the dark and walked the 4 blocks to the bakery. Hector was already there. He was standing at the prep counter in the back kitchen, with his sleeves rolled to the elbows, his hands moving through a bowl of dough, with the unhurried confidence of someone who had done this particular thing 10,000 times and had stopped needing to think about it. The kitchen smelled extraordinary yeast and warmth, and something sweet underneath the pan dulce he had been perfecting for 2 weeks, and beneath all of it threading through everything like a melody. You half recognized the particular sourdough starter we had been feeding for 3 weeks from the recipe Eleanor had written in her blue notebook. Hector looked up when I came in. "Couldn't sleep either," he said. It was not a question. "Not a chance," I said. He tilted his head toward the counter beside him, where a second apron was folded. I tied it on and washed my hands and took my place at the counter, and for the next 2 hours, neither of us said very much at all. We did not need to. There is a particular companionship that exists between people working side by side towards something they both care about, a companionship that does not require conversation to be real. By 6:30, we had sourdough loaves in the oven, 2 trays of pan dulce cooling on wire racks, a batch of morning buns glazed with orange sugar, and a pot of coffee that Hector had brewed strong enough to wake the building. At 7 o'clock, I unlocked the front door. The first person in line was Nora Bates. She was wearing her tan raincoat and her Powell's Books tote bag and a red wool scarf I had not seen before. And she was holding a small bunch of flowers, yellow chrysanthemums, the cheerful, unpretentious kind, which she held out to me with both hands when I opened the door. "For Eleanor," she said simply. My throat closed around something sharp and unexpected, and for a moment I could not speak. I took the flowers and nodded, and Nora patted my arm once with the matter-of-fact tenderness of a woman who has lived long enough to know that sometimes a nod is the most honest answer available. I put the chrysanthemums in a glass of water on the counter where everyone could see them. The morning moved fast after that. Word had traveled up and down Northwest 23rd with the speed that news travels in close-knit neighborhoods. The new bakery was open. It smelled incredible. The sourdough was the real thing. By 8 o'clock, we had a line out the door. By 9:30, we had sold out of the morning buns entirely, and Hector was already mixing a second batch of pan dulce in the back, calling out the door to me that he needed another pound of butter from the supply shelf. I was taking an order from a young couple their first time in. They said they had smelled the bread from half a block away when the bell above the front door rang, and I looked up. Dorothea Finch was standing in the doorway of Eleanor's Bakehouse in Portland, Oregon, in her good blue coat, pulling a rolling carry-on behind her, looking around the space with the expression of a woman who had traveled 3,000 miles and found exactly what she expected. My mouth opened. Nothing came out. "Don't just stand there with your mouth open, Raymond," she said, wheeling her bag to the side and beginning to unbutton her coat. "Tell me where you keep the aprons. I didn't fly across the country to watch. Something happened to my chest that I have no adequate word for. It was not quite crying, and it was not quite laughing, and it was not quite either of those things, but it was large and sudden, and it caught me entirely off guard. I pressed the back of my hand against my mouth for a moment, hard, and breathed through my nose. "Middle drawer left of the sink," I said when I trusted my voice again. Dorothea nodded, approvingly, found the apron, tied it with the brisk efficiency of a woman who had managed classrooms of 30 children for decades, and took her place beside Hector, behind the counter, as though she had always been there. Hector looked at her, then at me, then back at her. "You must be Dorothea," he said. "I must be," she agreed. "You must be the baker. The pan dulce is extraordinary. I had one while Raymond was distracted." Hector grinned so widely it looked like it might hurt. At noon, when the morning rush had eased, and Hector was in the back, prepping for the afternoon, I slipped out to the small table by the window with my phone and called Pastor Greer. He picked up on the third ring, slightly breathless. "William," I said, "we opened this morning." "Raymond." His voice warmed immediately. "How did it go?" "We sold out of the morning buns by 9:30, I said. He made a sound that was half laugh and half something else. "Eleanor would have said that was entirely predictable," he said. "She would have," I agreed. "She would have said it, and then she would have made another batch before I even asked her to." There was a comfortable pause, the kind that exists between people who do not need to fill silence to feel connected. Then Pastor Greer said, "How are you, Raymond, truly?" I looked around the bakery at Dorothea, laughing at something Nora Bates had said, at the chrysanthemums in their glass of water on the counter, at the afternoon light coming through the front windows and laying itself across the worn hardwood floor in long, warm strips. "I think," I said carefully, "that I might be all right." I said it like a man who was genuinely surprised to find it was true. That evening, after we had closed and cleaned, and Dorothea had declared the day a complete success before going to check into her hotel on Northwest Everett, Hector and I sat in the empty bakery with the last 2 cups of coffee from the pot, too tired to move, too satisfied to care about being tired. "Good first day," Hector said. "Good first day," I agreed. I reached under the counter and set Eleanor's recipe book on the table between us, open to the first page. Hector read the words she had written there and was quiet for a moment. "She was right about the patience part," he said finally. "She was right about most things," I said. The bakery was quiet and warm and smelled like bread. And outside on Northwest 23rd, the city was doing what cities do at the end of a day, settling, slowing, finding its way toward rest. I sat with my coffee and felt for the first time in a very long time that the ground beneath me was steady. Then Hector's phone buzzed on the table. He glanced at it and his expression shifted. "Mr. Calloway," he said, looking up at me with an expression that had gone careful and still. "Someone just threw a rock through the back window." "Before I tell you what Mitchell did next, comment the number 10, so I know you're still with me. Because what's coming changed everything I thought I understood about how far a person will go. A heads up, what follows contains some fictional elements woven in for storytelling purposes. It may not reflect events exactly as they occurred. If that's not your preference, this is a good place to stop. The rock had come through the lower left pane of the back window, the one that faced the narrow service alley behind the building. It was sitting on the kitchen floor, amid a scatter of broken glass, when Hector and I went back to look at it. An ordinary landscaping stone, the kind sold in bags at hardware stores, with nothing written on it, and nothing distinctive about it, except the deliberateness of its presence. Officer Danny Pratt arrived within 20 minutes of our call. He was younger than I had imagined from Dorothea's description, mid-30s, with the unhurried manner of someone who had learned early in his career that arriving somewhere fast and arriving somewhere composed were two different things, and that the second was almost always more useful. He crouched beside the broken glass with a flashlight, examined the window frame, looked at the alley through the gap. "Anyone out there when it happened?" he asked. "We were at the front of the building," Hector said. "Heard it came back. Nobody in the alley." Officer Pratt nodded, making notes. "Any idea who might want to do this?" I looked at him steadily. "I have a reasonable suspicion," I said, "but I don't have evidence yet. I'd rather not name anyone until I do." He looked up from his notepad. He had the kind of eyes that had seen enough of human behavior to not be easily misled, but also to not push harder than the situation required. "Fair enough," he said. "I'll file the report. Get that window boarded tonight, and replaced. Properly broken glass in a food service space is a health code issue. If anything else happens, call me directly." He handed me a card with his direct number written on the back in ballpoint pen. The next morning, my phone started lighting up before 7 o'clock. Google reviews, 3 new ones posted overnight. 1 star each. The usernames were the kind of randomly generated strings that suggested freshly created accounts. The reviews were variations on the same theme: an elderly man running a bakery under false pretenses had abandoned his family's stolen property, not to be trusted. One of them used the phrase "known fraud" with the confidence of someone who had never been required to define the word legally. Hector read them over my shoulder, his jaw tightening with each one. "This is Mitchell," he said. "Probably," I said. "Not probably." Hector said, his voice edging toward heat. "Raymond, this is him. He's trying to kill the business before it has a chance to breathe." I understood his anger. I felt it too, the way you feel a burn, sharp and immediate, and then settling into a deep, insistent throb. But I had learned something in 60 years, that Hector at 44 was still in the process of learning anger is useful for about 30 seconds, and after that, it starts costing you more than it gives you. "I know," I said. "Let's open the bakery." Hector stared at me for a moment, with an expression that said he found my composure either admirable or infuriating, and had not yet decided which. Then he untied his jacket, put on his apron, and went to start the ovens. I called Warren Stokes at 8 o'clock. Warren Stokes, I should explain for anyone who has not been following closely, was the private investigator I had retained, through Sterling Vance's recommendation, a 60-year-old former Connecticut State Police detective who ran a small but well-regarded investigative firm in Hartford. He was not a dramatic man. He did not deliver information with flourishes or build to revelations. He stated facts the way a carpenter measures twice precisely without embellishment, because the precision was the point. The Google reviews were posted from IP addresses in the Greenwich area, Warren said when I told him. I can't give you names from IP addresses without a subpoena, but the geographic pattern is consistent with what you'd expect. A pause. The rock through the window is more interesting. I've been watching Mitchell's communications through legal channels, phone records, public social media business correspondence that's entered the public record through the Hartford court filings. 3 days ago, he made 2 calls to a number registered to a man named Dale Pruitt in Stamford. Pruitt has 2 prior convictions for vandalism and 1 for criminal harassment. I was standing at the front window of the bakery when Warren said this, watching a woman lock her bicycle to the rack outside and come in for her morning coffee, entirely unaware that the place she was walking into had been attacked the previous night. Can we connect Mitchell to Pruitt directly? I asked. Not yet, Warren said. Phone calls establish contact, not instruction. I need something that puts them together in person or establishes the nature of the arrangement. I'm working on it. Another pause. Raymond, there's something else. I've been monitoring Mitchell's public movements, social media check-ins, business event registrations, that kind of thing. He met with someone at a Starbucks on Greenwich Avenue 4 days ago. Outdoor seating, public space. I had someone there. I kept my voice level. And the conversation was recorded, Warren said. Connecticut is a 2-party consent state when it comes to private conversations, meaning you generally need both parties' consent to record. But there is a well-established exception: conversations that take place in a public location where there is no reasonable expectation of privacy. An outdoor cafe, a public park, a sidewalk can be legally recorded by anyone present, including a third party. The Starbucks outdoor seating on Greenwich Avenue is fully public. No enclosure, no expectation of privacy. What was said? I asked. Mitchell was talking to someone about the bakery, Warren said. About making sure it didn't last long enough to become established. He used specific language about the reviews and about a brief pause, physical disruption. The words landed in my chest like stones dropped into still water, sending ripples outward in every direction. My son, sitting at an outdoor table at a Starbucks on a Tuesday afternoon in Greenwich, Connecticut, planning how to destroy something I had built with my hands, and Eleanor's recipes in a city he had never visited. Warren, I said quietly, keep the recording. Don't release it. Don't use it yet. I want to wait until the moment it does the most good. There was a pause on Warren's end. You're playing a longer game than I expected, he said. I learned it from my wife, I said. That afternoon, 3 customers came in specifically to tell us they had seen the negative reviews online and had driven over to judge for themselves. All 3 bought bread. One of them, a woman in her 60s with paint-stained fingers who introduced herself as a retired art teacher, bought 2 sourdough loaves, a bag of morning buns, and 4 pan dulce, and told Hector his grandmother's recipe was the best thing she had eaten in Portland in a year. Hector's eyes went bright, and he had to look at the ceiling for a moment before he could answer her. I watched that, and I thought, this is what Mitchell's attack looks like from where I am standing. This is what it amounts to. 3 bad reviews and a broken window against this woman with paint on her fingers, driving across the city because she wanted to make up her own mind. At closing time, Warren sent a follow-up message. Raymond, I've verified the location and recording quality. The Starbucks recording will hold up. But I want you to know there's more coming. Something I need to verify before I bring it to you. Give me a few days. I read the message twice, then set my phone face down on the counter. Hector, I said, tomorrow morning let's add a second sourdough to the menu. Different hydration, slightly more sour. Eleanor had a variation in the notebook. I've been meaning to try it. Hector looked at me from across the kitchen, reading my face the way he had learned to read it over the past weeks. You're not worried, he said. It was not quite a question. I'm not finished, I said. She walked in on a Wednesday afternoon, the kind of quiet midweek hour when the morning rush has gone and the after-school crowd has not yet arrived, and the bakery belongs mostly to itself. I was restocking the front display case when the bell above the door rang. I looked up and my hands went still on the tray I was holding. Vanessa Holt was standing in the doorway of Eleanor's bakehouse, wearing less makeup than I had ever seen on her and a gray coat I did not recognize. Her eyes were red at the rims, the lids slightly swollen in the way that comes from genuine crying or from very good preparation for the appearance of it. She looked around the bakery, slowly taking in the brick wall and the display cases and the battered oak counter. And then her eyes found mine and she pressed her lips together, as though steadying herself. "Raymond," she said. Her voice was soft and slightly unsteady. "I wasn't sure you'd let me in." I set the tray down carefully. "The door is open to everyone," I said. "Sit down, Vanessa. I'll get you something." She sat at the table by the window, the table nearest the front, in full view of the street, and unwound her scarf with hands that trembled slightly. I poured 2 cups of coffee and carried them over, then sat down across from her. "Mitchell doesn't know I'm here," she said immediately. "He'd be furious if he knew." "All right," I said. She looked down at her coffee cup, turning it slowly in her hands. "I need you to know that I never wanted any of this to happen. The house, the locks, that was Mitchell and his mother. I told him it was wrong. I told him you deserved better." Her voice cracked on the last word cleanly and at exactly the right moment. "He doesn't listen to me, Raymond. He hasn't listened to me in years. And now everything is falling apart and I don't know what to do, and I have nowhere to go." She lifted her eyes to mine, and they were full of tears that had not yet fallen, balanced there with impressive precision. I listened to all of it. I did not interrupt, did not challenge, did not show her anything on my face except attentiveness. I had been married to Eleanor Calloway for 31 years, and Eleanor had told me once in her direct way, "Real tears don't need an audience, Raymond. They arrive whether anyone is watching or not." These tears were performing. But I let Vanessa perform because a person who believes they are succeeding tells you more than a person who knows they have been caught. While she talked, I noticed the small things. The way her eyes moved, not to my face when she spoke, the way a genuinely distressed person looks at the person they are appealing to, but to the room around me. The door to the back office left slightly ajar. The laptop on the counter where Hector kept the supplier spreadsheets. The filing cabinet against the wall. Her gaze moved across these things quickly, and then returned to my face, but not quickly enough. She was looking for something. Hector appeared briefly in the kitchen doorway, caught my eye, and gave the smallest possible nod toward the corner of the ceiling above the front counter. I did not look at the camera. I did not need to. "I'm afraid," Vanessa said, pressing her fingertips against her eyes. "Raymond, I'm genuinely afraid of what he might do next. To the bakery. To you. He's not thinking clearly. He's desperate and angry, and I don't know how to stop him." I let a moment pass. Then I leaned forward slightly and said in a tone that was entirely gentle, "Vanessa, I appreciate you coming. I know that wasn't easy." I picked up my coffee cup. "I want you to know that this bakery has very good security cameras. My attorney recommended them when we opened. They cover every corner of the interior." I paused just long enough. It's good to know everything is being documented, for everyone's protection. Something moved across her face. It was fast, a flicker quickly controlled, but it was there. The performance shifted almost imperceptibly, like a piece of music changing key. "Of course," she said. Her voice had lost something, some warmth that had been present a moment before. Yes, that makes sense." She finished her coffee in 2 quick sips, gathered her scarf, and stood up. "Thank you for listening," she said. The tears were gone as completely as if someone had switched them off. Any time, I said. I watched her walk out the door and down Northwest 23rd until she turned the corner and disappeared. Then I went to the back kitchen where Hector was standing with his arms crossed and an expression on his face that mixed admiration with something close to unease. She came to look for financial records, Hector said. It was not a question. That would be my guess, I said. And the camera got everything. Every second, I said. I picked up my phone and called Warren Stokes. He answered on the first ring, which meant he had been expecting the call. Vanessa just left, I said. The interior cameras have the full visit recorded. I want you to run the man she has been in contact with anyone outside her usual circle in the past 6 months. Financial connections, especially. Already working on it, Warren said. Raymond, I told you I had something to verify. I'm close. 2 more days. I ended the call and stood in the kitchen doorway, looking out at the empty table by the window, where Vanessa had sat, the coffee cup still there, a faint trace of her lipstick on the rim. Whatever she had come looking for, she had not found it, but she had left something behind without knowing it. The grand opening of Eleanor's Bakehouse fell on a Saturday in January, and by 8 in the morning, the line stretched half a block down Northwest 23rd Avenue. I had been at the bakery since 4. Hector had been there since 3:30, which I only discovered when I arrived, and found him already elbow-deep in the first dough batch, with the focused expression of a man who takes his responsibilities seriously enough to lose sleep over them. We worked side by side in the warm kitchen, while the street outside was still dark, and the smell that built in that space over those early hours, sourdough and pan dulce and the orange-glazed morning buns that had sold out in 90 minutes on opening day, was the closest thing to contentment I had felt in months. Nora Bates was first in line again. She had brought Dorothea, who was back in Portland for the weekend, specifically for the occasion, and the two of them stood on the sidewalk in the January cold, with their coats buttoned to the chin, talking with the easy familiarity of women who had only recently met, but had recognized in each other the particular quality of people who have survived difficult things without becoming bitter about it. By 9 o'clock, the bakery was full. By 10, Hector had his 2 part-time helpers moving at full speed and was still calling back to me for more of the sourdough loaves he had not expected to sell so quickly. I was pulling the 4th batch from the oven when Officer Danny Pratt walked through the front door. He was in uniform, which told me immediately that this was not a social visit. He made his way through the crowded bakery to the counter, and his face had the carefully neutral expression of a man delivering news he did not enjoy delivering. "Mr. Calloway," I said quietly, leaning forward so only I could hear. "I've received a complaint. Theft of personal property from a residence at 14 Meadow Lane, Greenwich, Connecticut. The complainant is alleging you removed items from the property prior to the sale without authorization. I need you to come to the station with me." I looked at him for a moment. Then I untied my apron, folded it over the counter, and said to Hector, "Keep the oven running. I'll be back." Hector's jaw tightened visibly. "Raymond, keep the oven running," I said again calmly. "It's fine." It was not fine in the sense that it was pleasant, but it was fine in the sense that I had known something like this was coming, and Sterling Vance was already in Portland. Sterling had flown in the previous day, a precaution he had suggested himself, after Mitchell's escalating pattern of legal maneuvers wanting to be physically present rather than managing things by phone. He was waiting outside the police station when Officer Pratt and I arrived, standing on the sidewalk in his overcoat with a leather document case under his arm, looking entirely unsurprised to be there. "Sterling," I said. "Raymond," he said, falling into step beside me. "Let's go in." In the interview room, Sterling laid the documents on the table with the methodical precision I had come to rely on. First, the formal property inventory, every item I had removed from 14 Meadow Lane before the closing listed in full, signed by me and notarized by Sterling's office, time-stamped 2 days before the sale completed. Second, the signed confirmation from Conrad Hawthorne that the property had been delivered in the agreed condition with no missing items. Third, a statement from Sterling himself, attesting to the timeline. Officer Pratt reviewed them carefully. His expression did not change, but something in the set of his shoulders shifted. Sterling then placed a fourth document on the table. "This is the restraining order protecting Mr. Conrad Hawthorne," he said, "obtained through Greenwich Superior Court and served on Mitchell James Calloway on the date of possession transfer. Mr. Mitchell Calloway has made multiple attempts to interfere with Mr. Hawthorne's possession of the property and has now filed a false police report against the previous owner." Sterling's voice was even and precise the way it always was, but there was an edge beneath it. "I would like to formally request that this report be recorded as potentially retaliatory and that Mr. Calloway's pattern of conduct be noted in the file." Officer Pratt looked at Sterling, then at me. "Mr. Calloway," he said, "you are free to go. I apologize for the interruption to your opening day." I nodded. "Just doing your job, officer." Sterling and I walked out of the station into the pale January afternoon. The cold hit my face and I stopped on the steps for a moment, breathing it in. "He filed a false police report," I said. "Yes," Sterling said, "which is itself a criminal matter should we choose to pursue it. I recommend we note it and hold it." I agreed. We were building something, Sterling and I, not a single attack, but a complete picture, the kind that a court sees all at once and cannot look away from. We were walking back toward the bakery when Warren Stokes stepped out of a coffee shop doorway ahead of us, hands in his coat pockets, as unhurried as a man who had simply happened to be in the neighborhood. "Both of you," he said. "Good. Save me a phone call." He reached into his coat and produced a USB drive, holding it between two fingers. The location verification came back clean. Outdoor seating, fully public, no enclosure. He looked at me steadily. "The recording holds up in court, Raymond. Every word. I'm about to play you something Mitchell never meant for anyone to hear. Before I do, leave a 'ready' in the comments. I want to know you're still with me for this part. A note worth mentioning: some elements in this next part are fictional, shaped to serve the story's message. If you'd rather not continue, this is your moment to step away gracefully." Sterling had a temporary office on the 4th floor of a shared workspace building on Southwest Morrison Street, 12 minutes from the police station by cab. We went there directly, the three of us, and by the time we arrived, Sterling had already called his paralegal to have a laptop and a set of speakers ready. The room was small and smelled like printer ink and institutional carpet. Warren set the USB drive on the table. Sterling plugged it in. Officer Pratt, who had agreed to accompany us as a professional courtesy after Sterling suggested the recording might be relevant to the false police report, filing, sat to one side with his notepad open. Warren pressed play. The recording had this quality of all outdoor audio background noise: a passing car, the faint sound of other conversations at neighboring tables. But Mitchell's voice came through clearly. He was speaking to someone whose voice was lower and less distinct, and the conversation was about the bakery on Northwest 23rd Avenue in Portland, about reviews that would discourage customers, about ensuring a new business did not establish itself long enough to become credible, about physical disruption as a fallback if the reviews were insufficient. He did not use words like hire or pay. People rarely do. But the meaning moved through the recording like a current through water, present and directional, unmistakable to anyone listening with honest ears. When it ended, the room was quiet for a moment. Officer Pratt looked up from his notepad. "I'm going to need a copy of that," he said. "Prepared in advance," Sterling said, and slid a second USB across the table. I had listened to the whole recording without moving. There was something particular about hearing your son's voice discuss the destruction of something you built, not the anger of it which I had expected, but the flatness. Mitchell sounded bored, methodical, as though dismantling his father's small bakery in a city he had never visited was simply a logistical problem to be managed. I thought of the recipe book. I thought of Hector arriving at 3:30 in the morning because he took his work seriously. I thought of Nora Bates standing in the cold, with yellow chrysanthemums. I pressed my back against my chair and breathed slowly through my nose until the feeling passed. I want to release it, I said. The recording, publicly. Sterling nodded. It was made in a public location, with no reasonable expectation of privacy. You have every right to release it. I would suggest we provide it to the Hartford Courant and to the business desk at the Connecticut Post simultaneously. Mitchell has business relationships in that area, and public knowledge of this recording will reach those relationships faster through local media than through any other channel. Do it today, I said. Sterling made 2 phone calls from the corner of the room. Warren and I sat with Officer Pratt, who asked a series of careful questions about the timeline of events since October, writing everything in his notepad with the thoroughness of a man building a file rather than taking casual notes. The media response was faster than I anticipated. By early evening, both outlets had posted the story online with the audio embedded. Sterling called to confirm. The following morning, Warren sent me a message. It read, Marcus Webb terminated his contract with Mitchell Callaway at 6:45 this morning. Webb's assistant told my contact that Webb had been watching Mitchell's conduct since the Hartford court filings appeared in public records last month and had already had private concerns. The recording removed any remaining doubt. I read that message standing at the front counter of the bakery during the morning rush, surrounded by customers who knew nothing about any of it, and I felt something shift inside me, not triumph, which would have been too simple, but a kind of settling the way a building stops moving after an earthquake, and you realize the structure held. Marcus Webb, I should explain, was Mitchell's largest business partner, a commercial real estate developer who had committed significant capital to a joint venture with Mitchell that had been the primary source of Mitchell's income for the past 2 years. Losing Webb did not just mean losing one contract. It meant losing the financial architecture that Mitchell's entire business operation had been built on. Later that afternoon, Warren called directly. There is one more thing, he said without preamble. The camera footage from the bakery. Vanessa's visit last week. A pause. I ran the number she texted during the visit. The recipient's name is Damian Rourke. He is not a business associate, and he is not a friend from before her marriage. Another pause, deliberate, and waited. I have 3 months of financial transfers between Vanessa's personal account and Rourke's. Significant amounts. Raymond. I think you need to consider showing this to Mitchell. I was quiet for a long moment. Give me 2 days to think about it, I said. Take the time, Warren said. But not too much. The trial date is being set. I put the phone down and looked at the apple pie Eleanor had written in her recipe book, the one Mitchell had loved as a boy, the one I had looked at the night the recording played for the first time. I closed the book gently. Whatever Mitchell had done, whatever he was still doing there, was a version of this story in which he was also a man about to discover that the person standing closest to him had been taking from him just as surely as he had taken from me. That thought did not give me pleasure. It gave me something much more complicated than pleasure. Warren came in before we opened. It was 20 minutes to 7, the bakery still dark at the front, and warm at the back, where Hector had the ovens running, and Warren arrived with 2 coffees from the shop next door and set them on the table by the window without being asked. He had learned in the weeks since we had begun working together that I preferred to receive difficult information sitting down with something warm in my hands. He opened his laptop without preamble and turned it to face me. The camera footage from the interior security system had been enhanced slightly for clarity, but the image was sharp enough. Vanessa was sitting at the table by the window, the same table where Warren and I were sitting now, which was not lost on me, and the timestamp in the corner read, the Wednesday of her visit. For the first 2 minutes of the footage, she sat as I had seen her hands around her coffee cup, talking. Then I left to check the back kitchen. The moment the kitchen door swung shut behind me, Vanessa moved. Her hand went to her coat pocket and came out with her phone. She held it up and photographed the screen of Hector's laptop on the counter, the supplier spreadsheet he had been working on open and visible. She then stood, took 3 steps toward the back office door, and pushed it open just far enough to look inside. She took 2 more photographs. Then she returned to her seat and had her coffee cup back in her hands by the time Hector appeared briefly in the kitchen doorway. The whole sequence took 47 seconds. I watched it without speaking. The coffee cup in my hands had gone slightly cool. "The financial transfers," I said. Warren nodded, pulling up a second file. 3 months of records from Vanessa's personal account surfaced through the financial disclosure process in the divorce proceedings Mitchell initiated in January. Once he filed, both parties were required to produce full financial records under Connecticut discovery rules. Vanessa's attorney submitted them. Mitchell's attorney forwarded everything to Sterling as part of case preparation, and Sterling shared what was relevant. He turned the laptop slightly. She did not expect Mitchell to ever see these. The transfers went to an account held by Damian Rourke. He turned the laptop slightly so I could see the figures clearly. Rourke is 41 years old, lives in Westport. No legitimate business connection to Vanessa that I can establish. The transfers began 8 months ago and total just over $90,000. $90,000. Moving out of the household, Mitchell believed he controlled into the account of a man Vanessa had apparently decided to build a different future with while she stood in Mitchell's kitchen and ate at Mitchell's table and flew to Hawaii on Mitchell's credit card. I sat with that for a moment. "I want Mitchell to see this," I said. Warren looked at me carefully. "Raymond, I know what he did to me," I said. "I know exactly what he is. But he is also a man whose wife has been stealing from him for 8 months, and I am not going to let him walk into a courtroom without knowing that the person he believes is standing beside him has been planning her exit for longer than his war with me has been going on." I looked at Warren steadily. He deserves to know the truth. Whatever else he is, he deserves that. Warren studied my face for a long moment, then nodded once. "I'll call him." Mitchell arrived 40 minutes later. He looked worse than I had expected. He had lost weight since I had last seen him at the house on Meadow Lane a lifetime ago, and the confidence that had always sat on him like a well-fitted coat had been replaced by something rawer and more uncertain. He stood in the doorway of Eleanor's bakehouse and looked at the space at the brick wall and the display cases and the name above the counter, and his jaw worked briefly before he controlled it. He sat down across from me without speaking. I did not offer pleasantries. I turned the laptop to face him and pressed play. He watched the footage without moving. His eyes tracked Vanessa across the screen, the phone coming out the photographs, the 3 steps toward the back office. And as he watched, I watched him. I watched the moment he understood what he was seeing. It arrived not as an explosion, but as a kind of internal collapse, like a wall that does not fall outward but simply folds in on itself. His face did not crumble, but something behind it did. When the footage ended, he stared at the black screen for a long moment. His hands, flat on the table, had gone white at the knuckles. "The financial records are in the folder beside the laptop," I said quietly. He did not open the folder. He already knew, I think. On some level, he had already known for longer than either of us wanted to say out loud. "Mitchell," I said, and he looked up at me with eyes that had gone red at the rims, not from performance, but from the particular pain of a person who has just had a truth confirmed that they had been working very hard not to see. "I did not show you this to hurt you further. I showed you because you have a right to know what is true. Whatever has happened between us, you have a right to know what is true." His throat moved. He pressed his lips together hard and looked at the table. "Why?" he said finally, his voice rough and stripped of everything except the question itself. "Why would you do that after everything I—" He stopped. Started again. "Why would you care what happens to me?" I looked at my son across the table of the bakery I had built with my wife's recipes, and a rented kitchen, and a man named Hector who arrived at 3:30 in the morning because he believed in the work. I did not answer the question directly. I had already said what needed to be said months ago when it had mattered most. What was left now was not words but action. I reached into the folder and placed a second document on the table. A simple employment contract for Eleanor's bakehouse minimum wage to start 30 hours per week, standard terms, a 6-month review clause built in. Mitchell stared at me. His chin was shaking badly now, and he was fighting it with everything he had, pressing his jaw together until the muscle in his cheek jumped. I stood up because I knew that what he needed most in that moment was not my presence but the space to fall apart without an audience. "The trial date is being set," I said. "Sterling will handle everything. When it is over, we will talk about what comes next." I picked up the laptop and the folder. "Finish your coffee, Mitchell. The morning buns are good today." I walked into the back kitchen and let the door swing closed behind me. Hector was at the prep counter, not looking at me, giving me the particular gift of a man who understands when to be present without intruding. He slid a fresh morning bun onto a small plate and pushed it toward me without a word. I picked it up and ate it standing at the counter, and outside in the front of the bakery I could hear faintly the sound of my son beginning to understand the full weight of what this year had cost everyone. The trial was coming, and for the first time since October I felt entirely ready for it. There were 2 courtrooms. I want to be clear about that, because people sometimes imagine these things as a single dramatic confrontation in a single room. And the reality was more procedural and less cinematic than that. The first courtroom was in Hartford, Connecticut, at the Hartford County Superior Court, where Mitchell had filed his original challenge to the property sale. The second was in Portland, Oregon, at the Multnomah County Circuit Court, where the harassment and criminal charges related to the restraining order violation and the false police report were being adjudicated. Sterling handled both. I only had to appear in person for the Hartford proceeding. I flew back to Connecticut on a gray February morning, the first time I had been back since the day I boarded the Greyhound bus with Eleanor's recipe book and one duffel bag. The approach into Bradley International gave me a view of the state from above the coastline. The wooded interior, the particular density of the suburbs spreading out from the shore, and I looked at it through the small oval window with the feeling of a man returning to a place that no longer held him, the way you can revisit a house you grew up in and recognize every room without belonging to any of them anymore. Sterling met me at the courthouse steps in Hartford. He had the documents under his arm, and the expression of a man who had done this many times and knew exactly how it would go. "Vanessa," I asked as we went up the steps. "She left 3 weeks ago," Sterling said. "Took what she could from the joint accounts before Mitchell's attorney could freeze them. She and Rourke are apparently in Florida." He said it with the neutral precision of a man reporting weather. Mitchell knows. He has his own attorney handling the divorce. Inside the courtroom, Mitchell was already seated at the respondent's table with his attorney, a Hartford lawyer named Grover, who had the slightly overworked look of someone managing a case that kept producing new complications. Mitchell did not look at me when I came in. He was staring at the table in front of him, his hands folded together tightly, and he looked like a man who had not slept properly in weeks, which I suspected he had not. Dorothea Finch was in the gallery, having driven up from Greenwich. She gave me a small nod when I sat down, the kind that carries a great deal without saying any of it. Judge Harold Simmons entered and the room stood. He was 62, silver-haired, with the particular authority of a man who had presided over enough human difficulty that very little surprised him anymore. He reviewed the documents before him with the unhurried thoroughness of someone who intended to understand what he was ruling on before he ruled on it. Mitchell's attorney went first. He argued emotional distress, undue haste, insufficient consideration of the marital home's significance. He was competent and organized, and was making the best argument available to him, which was not in truth a very strong one. Sterling responded without theatrics. He submitted the deed, the will, the notarized inventory, Dr. Owens's neuropsychological assessment, the timeline of the sale, and the full documented record of Mitchell's subsequent conduct. The mental competency motion already denied with prejudice, the false police report, the restraining order violations, the harassment campaign. He laid each document on the clerk's table with the quiet confidence of a man who knows the facts are doing all the necessary work. Dr. Patricia Owens took the stand and gave her testimony in the same direct, precise manner she brought to everything. She confirmed her findings, answered Mitchell's attorney's cross-examination questions without being rattled, and stepped down. Dorothea Finch testified briefly about what she had witnessed on the day Mitchell returned from Hawaii. The confrontation at the door. The letter Mitchell sitting on the curb. She spoke quietly and without embellishment, and her credibility was the kind that comes from a 71-year-old retired schoolteacher with no conceivable motive to lie. Judge Simmons listened to everything. When both sides had finished, he looked at his documents for a long moment. Then he looked up. "Mr. Mitchell Calloway," he said, his voice carrying the particular weight of someone who does not raise it because he does not need to. "This court has reviewed the complete record of this matter. The property at 14 Meadow Lane was held under joint tenancy with right of survivorship. Upon the death of Eleanor Calloway, full legal title transferred automatically and entirely to Raymond Calloway. Mitchell Calloway had no ownership interest, no legal claim, and no standing to challenge this sale." He paused. "Furthermore, the record of Mr. Mitchell Calloway's conduct subsequent to the sale, including a mental competency motion, denied with prejudice a false police report, and multiple violations of a valid restraining order, suggests a pattern of bad faith litigation and harassment rather than any genuine legal grievance." Mitchell's hands on the table had gone still. "The petitioner's claims are denied in their entirety," Judge Simmons said. "Costs are awarded to the respondent. I would strongly caution the petitioner against any further legal action in this matter." He struck his gavel. "Sterling called me from Portland that evening while I was still at the Hartford airport waiting for my return flight. He kept it brief, the way he always did when the news was good, and the facts spoke for themselves. In Portland, the Multnomah County proceeding had concluded the same week. On the documentary record, he had submitted no hearing required. Mitchell was found liable for criminal harassment and violation of a restraining order. He was fined $15,000 and placed on 12 months supervised probation. At the airport in Hartford waiting for my flight, and I sat by the gate window and watched the planes on the tarmac, and thought about Mitchell sitting at that courtroom table with his hands folded and his eyes down. I thought about the boy who had eaten Eleanor's apple pie every Sunday and asked for seconds without fail. I thought about the man who had sat in my bakery 3 weeks ago with his jaw shaking and asked me why I still cared. My flight was called. I picked up my bag and walked toward the gate, and I did not look back at the Connecticut skyline through the terminal windows. I was going home. 3 months after the verdict, Warren Stokes sent me a photograph. It arrived on a Tuesday morning in May while I was behind the counter at Eleanor's bakehouse cutting the first sourdough loaves of the day. Portland in May had finally committed to something resembling warmth. The gray had lifted slightly, the rain came less frequently, and the foot traffic on Northwest 23rd had the relaxed quality of people who had survived another Pacific Northwest winter and were cautiously pleased about it. I wiped my hands on my apron and opened the message. The photograph showed a commercial building on a street I recognized as being in the financial district of Stamford, Connecticut. The glass door at the entrance had a corporate name etched into it, Mitchell Calloway Properties, LLC, but the name had been partially scraped away, leaving a ghost of letters on the glass. Through the window, the office was empty. A new tenant's moving boxes were visible in the background. I looked at that photograph for a long time. I had continued retaining Warren after the trial, concluded not to gather ammunition, but because I believed that before Mitchell and I could have any kind of honest conversation, I needed to understand the full shape of what had happened to him. A man who does not know what he is walking toward makes poor decisions about how to walk. Warren had been thorough, as he always was. Marcus Webb's termination had been the first domino. Without that anchor contract, Mitchell's business had been unsustainable within 60 days. The office lease had gone unpaid. The remaining staff, 2 employees, Warren told me, had left within weeks of each other when the paychecks became unreliable. Mitchell had attempted to secure alternative financing through 2 different lenders and had been declined both times, the Hartford court record appearing in standard background checks and raising flags that no amount of smooth talking could lower. Vanessa had taken $43,000 from the joint accounts in the 3 days before Mitchell's attorney filed to freeze them. She and Damian Rourke had surfaced briefly on social media in Fort Lauderdale before going quiet. Mitchell's divorce attorney had filed the paperwork, but with no shared assets remaining to divide, the proceedings were largely administrative. Gloria Holt Warren reported was living in a studio apartment in Bridgeport on a fixed income, having liquidated a small investment account to cover her living expenses. After the arrangements, she had apparently expected to persist a son-in-law with money. A daughter in a comfortable home had dissolved entirely. I was thinking about all of this when Nora Bates settled into her corner table with her morning coffee and sourdough and looked at me over the rim of her cup with the observant expression she always wore. "You have your thinking face on," she said. "The one that means you're carrying something heavy." I set down the photograph on the counter face down. "Old news," I said. Nora tilted her head. "Is it sitting well?" I considered that question honestly, the way I had learned from Eleanor, to consider questions that deserved honest answers rather than comfortable ones. "No," I said, "not entirely." Nora nodded slowly, as though this was the answer she had expected and respected. She had told me her own story in pieces over the months she had been coming to the bakery, 3 adult children, 2 of whom had stopped calling after she declined to fund a business venture that she had correctly assessed as unviable one, of whom called every Sunday without fail, and drove up from Eugene once a month to take her to lunch. She understood the particular pain of a parent who loves without condition and is not loved back in kind. "Raymond," she said, "do you feel better knowing what happened to him?" I opened my mouth and then closed it again, because the honest answer required a moment to locate. "No," I said finally, "I really don't." Nora picked up her coffee cup and held it in both hands. "That's because you're not the kind of man who wanted this outcome," she said. "You wanted your son back. You wanted him to be someone who didn't do what he did. That's a different thing entirely from wanting him to suffer." I pressed my hand flat on the counter and looked at the wood grain. Eleanor had wanted me to walk away and build something. She had been right about that. But I did not think she had wanted Mitchell to lose everything in the process. She had loved him too, in her clear-eyed, unsentimental way. Hector came through from the back kitchen, set a fresh tray of morning buns in the display case, and glanced at my face. "Slow morning?" he asked. "Thinking morning," I said. He nodded and went back to the kitchen without pressing further, which was one of the things I had come to value most about him. That evening, after we had closed and cleaned, and Nora had gone home with an extra sourdough loaf tucked under her arm, I sat in the back kitchen with the day's last cup of coffee and Eleanor's recipe book open in my lap. I turned to the page she had written. The goal was never to win Raymond. The goal was always just to survive with your dignity intact. I read those words 3 times. Then I looked at my phone sitting face up on the counter beside me. It had been sitting there all evening, and for all of that evening I had been aware, in the way you are aware of a sound that is not quite loud enough to demand attention, that the decision I had been circling for 3 months had arrived. I picked up the phone. I found Mitchell's number. I looked at it for longer than I would like to admit, long enough that the screen dimmed and I had to tap it back to life. Then I pressed call. It rang twice. Then quietly Mitchell answered. "Dad," he said. His voice was rough and stripped down the voice of a man who had stopped performing for anyone. Just one word, and I could hear 3 months of consequence in it. "Mitchell," I said, "I think it's time we talked." He walked in at 7:45 in the morning, 15 minutes before we opened. I heard the door and came out from the back kitchen to find Mitchell standing just inside the entrance, his hands in the pockets of a coat I did not recognize, cheaper than anything he had worn during the years when money had seemed like a permanent condition rather than a circumstance. He was thinner than he had been in February. His face had the particular quality of a man who had stopped trying to look like everything was fine, which was, I realized, the first honest thing his face had done in a very long time. He looked around Eleanor's bakehouse slowly. At the brick wall. At the display cases with the morning's first loaves already cooling on the racks. At the name above the counter, Eleanor's Bakehouse, in the plain, hand-lettered style Hector and I had chosen together, nothing ornate, nothing that tried too hard. His eyes stopped on the name for a moment longer than everything else. Hector appeared briefly in the kitchen doorway, read the situation hot with the efficiency of a man who had learned to read rooms, and went quietly back to the ovens without being asked. He had placed a small bunch of white flowers on the counter that morning. Without explanation, he had remembered in his quiet way what day it was. I pulled out 2 chairs at the table by the window and sat down in one of them. Mitchell crossed the room and sat in the other. He did not speak immediately. He looked at the table, at his own hands, at the middle distance between us. His jaw moved once, twice, like a man rehearsing something he had prepared and finding it inadequate now that the moment had arrived. "I don't know how to start," he said finally. His voice was rough at the edges, scraped clean of the smooth confidence it had always carried before. "You don't have to start anywhere in particular," I said. "We have time." He looked up at me then, and I saw something in his face that I had not seen since he was very young. A rawness, an absence of performance, the face of a person who has run out of the energy required to be anything other than what they are. It did not make what he had done smaller, but it made him human in a way that mattered to me. "I chose that day deliberately," he said. "The day of Mom's memorial. I knew what I was doing." He stopped. His throat moved. "I don't have an explanation for that. I've been trying to find one for a year and I can't. There isn't one." I did not fill the space he left. I had learned from Eleanor that some silences need to be inhabited rather than resolved, and this was one of them. "She would have been ashamed of me," Mitchell said, his voice dropping to something barely above a whisper. His eyes had gone red and wet, and this time there was no audience to perform, for no strategic advantage to be gained. "Mom, she would have been—" He stopped, pressed the back of his hand against his mouth, the way I had done in that $47 motel room a year ago, fighting the same losing battle against the same kind of grief. I knew that even when I was doing it. I knew she would have been ashamed of me, and I did it anyway. His shoulders had begun to shake. Not dramatically, not with the full collapse of a man making a scene, but with the small contained shaking of someone trying very hard to hold together and not entirely succeeding. I reached across the table and put my hand on his arm briefly and firmly, the way a father does when words are not the point. He pulled in a breath that shuddered on its way in and steadied on its way out. I stood up and went to the counter. I came back with the folder I had prepared over the previous weeks, a document I had put together, methodically, without anger, with the same care I gave to Eleanor's recipes. I set it on the table between us. "This is not a punishment," I said, sitting back down. "I want you to understand that before you open it." Mitchell opened the folder. Inside was the accounting I had spent 3 evenings compiling. Every significant financial contribution I had made to Mitchell's life from the age of 18 onward, college tuition at the University of Connecticut, The deposit on his first apartment in New Haven, the down payment I had quietly covered when he and Vanessa bought their car, the rehearsal dinner, the business loan I had given him 6 years ago, that had been repaid only partially and then quietly forgotten. Each item was listed with the year, the amount, and a current value adjusted for inflation. The total in today's dollars was $212,000. Mitchell turned the pages slowly. His face was very still, and I could see him doing what I had hoped he would do, not calculating, not looking for counter-arguments, but actually reading, actually seeing. "I'm not asking for this back," I said when he reached the last page. "I want to be absolutely clear about that. I am asking you to look at it, to really look at it. Because I think you went through the last year believing I had taken something from you, and I want you to see what the ledger actually says." Mitchell stared at the last page for a long time. When he looked up, his eyes were wet, and he was not fighting it anymore. "What do you want from me?" he asked. His voice was very quiet. I reached into the folder and placed a second document on the table. A simple employment contract for Eleanor's bakehouse, minimum wage, to start 30 hours per week, standard terms, a 6-month review clause built in. "You start by sweeping the floor," I said. "That is what I did when I was building everything from nothing. I swept the floor, and I kept showing up, and I did the work in front of me. That is all I am asking." Mitchell looked at the contract for a long time. Then he picked up the pen I had placed beside it and signed his name on the line at the bottom. His handwriting was smaller than it used to be, I noticed. Less expansive, more careful. He set the pen down. I reached under the counter and placed a folded apron on the table between us. Navy blue, the same as Hector's, with Eleanor's Bakehouse embroidered across the front, in the same plain lettering as the sign above the door. Mitchell picked it up and held it in his hands, looking at the name stitched into the fabric. Eleanor's Bakehouse. His mother's name on the thing his father had built with her recipes after his son had locked him out of his own home on the day of her memorial. His chin was shaking very badly now. He pressed his lips together hard and breathed through his nose, and his eyes were spilling over, and he was not trying to stop them anymore, and I thought, good. Let it come. Let it cost what it costs. That is the only way through. "The broom is in the closet by the back door," I said. "Hector will show you where everything goes." I stood up and walked back to the kitchen. Behind me I heard the scrape of Mitchell's chair, the sound of him standing, and then after a moment, the soft sound of the closet door opening. April arrived in Greenwich without asking permission. The maple trees along the cemetery path had leafed out pale green tender, and new in the way that April growth always is, not the blazing amber of October, not the stripped bare gray of February, but something quieter and more tentative, the color of a world still deciding whether it was ready to begin again. Somewhere above the iron gate, a robin was singing like it had somewhere important to be, and the morning air carried that particular combination of damp earth and new grass that I had always associated, without quite knowing why, with the feeling of surviving something. I carried 8 white roses, same as always. Same as the very first morning I had come here without knowing what came next, when the lock on my own front door had refused my key and 2 suitcases had been waiting on the porch like evidence. Eleanor had always said white roses were honest flowers. They don't try to be anything, they're not. Raymond, just clean and simple and true. I had bought 8 of them from the same florist on Putnam Avenue I had used every year, and the woman behind the counter had not asked why I always bought 8, and not 10. And I had not explained Eleanor's old superstition that odd numbers carried unfinished business in them. 8 was whole. 8 was settled. Mitchell walked beside me. He didn't say anything, and I didn't ask him to. His work boots were muddy at the toe. He'd been at the bakehouse since 6 that morning. He told me when I picked him up at the corner rebuilding a storage shelf in the back room from reclaimed pine he'd hauled in from the salvage yard on Powell Boulevard himself. His coat smelled faintly of sawdust and cinnamon, And something shifted in my chest when I caught that combination. Because Eleanor had always said you could tell a man's character by what he smelled like at the end of a workday. She would have recognized that smell. She would have loved it. We walked the gravel path without speaking. The crunch under our feet was the same sound it had always been, the same sound I had heard every October 14th for 4 years, first in grief, then in something like grief's quieter cousin, and now in something I did not yet have a name for, but which felt cautiously like the beginning of peace. We stopped at her headstone. Eleanor Marie Calloway. Beloved wife, devoted mother. She fed people in every way that mattered. Mitchell crouched down without being asked and pulled a small clump of crabgrass from the base of the stone, his thick-knuckled hands. Hector's hands, nearly the same kind of hands that knew how to do things, moving slowly and carefully. His jaw was tight. He was doing what he had been learning to do over these past months at the bakehouse, working through feeling rather than around it, using his hands to say what his voice couldn't manage yet. I should have come sooner, he said. His voice was rough at the edges the way it always was now when he let himself be honest. She knew you loved her, I told him. That's not the same as saying it was enough. But she always knew more than either of us gave her credit for. He stood, nodded once, and said nothing more. That was its own kind of progress. I laid the roses against the base of the stone. All 8 of them fanned out against the granite. And then I reached into my jacket pocket for the envelope. Sterling had returned it to me after the Hartford proceedings concluded, sealed and untouched exactly as it had been when Dorothea had held it through all those difficult months. I had carried it from Portland in my breast pocket close to my chest for the entire flight back to Connecticut. I had not opened it on the plane. I had known without being able to explain exactly why that this was where it belonged, to be opened here in April, with the robins singing above the gate, and Mitchell standing beside me in muddy work boots that smelled like the bakehouse Eleanor had always known I would build. I broke the seal and unfolded the pages. Eleanor's handwriting was steady and unhurried on pale blue stationery, the good kind she had always bought, because she said cheap stationery was a false economy. She had pressed the pen firmly into the paper the way she always wrote, as though she wanted the words to leave a mark that lasted. Raymond, if you're reading this, the hard part is already done. You already did it. I knew you would even when you didn't know it yourself. What I'm asking now is simpler. Put it down. Not for him, for you. The man I married didn't carry things that had already been settled. The bakehouse was always yours, even before you knew it. You used to stand in the kitchen on Saturday mornings before the coffee was ready, before you were properly awake, and say that the smell of bread was the closest thing you knew to peace. Build that. Fill it with people who need that kind of peace. And when it's warm and loud and smells the way Saturdays used to smell, sit somewhere in the middle of it all and know that I'm there too. I always will be. I love you. I always did. I always will. Eleanor. My throat tightened around whatever sound was trying to come out. I stood still in the April light with the letter in both hands and let the feeling move through me rather than trying to hold it back. Because Eleanor had always said, a man who refuses to feel is just a man who refuses to live. And I had spent enough of the last year and a half learning that she had been right about nearly everything. Mitchell had stepped back instinctively to give me space. But when he heard me exhale something between a breath and a sound I hadn't made in a very long time, he moved closer again. He didn't say anything, careful or rehearsed. Didn't reach for my shoulder the way people do when they want to be seen comforting someone. He just stood near his presence, solid and quiet, carrying the smell of pine and cinnamon and honest work. That was enough. More than enough. I folded the letter carefully along its original creases and placed it back in the envelope. She wrote to me, I said, when I trusted my voice again. Not the legal pieces, those were for the courts to protect what needed protecting. This one was for me. Mitchell looked at the headstone. What did she say? That she knew everything. I paused. And that she wanted me to let it go. He was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was careful and genuine, the way it had been learning to be. I thought about Hector arriving at 3:30 in the morning, because he took the bread seriously, because he understood without being told that the thing we were building together was not a business transaction, but an act of faith. I thought about Nora Bates at her corner table with her crossword puzzle, her Powell's Books tote bag hooked over the back of the chair, her dry wit, and her patient eyes. I thought about a woman who had come in last Tuesday, pointed at the morning bun in the display case, and said my mother used to make these, and then pressed her hand gently over her mouth, before she smiled the way people do when a memory arrives unexpectedly and finds them unprepared for how good it feels. Getting there, I said. It was the most honest answer I had, and it was the only kind Eleanor had ever wanted from me. We walked back along the gravel path together, the robin still singing somewhere overhead, the pale green maples catching the morning light. Neither of us spoke, and the silence between us had a different quality than it had once held. Not the silence of two people with too much unresolved between them, but the silence of two people who have begun carefully and imperfectly to find their way back to each other. In the parking lot, Mitchell stopped with his hand on the door of his truck. He was making the long drive back to Portland today, back to the bakehouse and the storage shelf, and the work that was slowly, steadily making him into someone his mother would have recognized. Dad. He said it the way he had on the phone that evening in May, carefully, like a word he was still learning to trust again. Thank you for calling. He stopped, shook his head slightly. For all of it. Thank your mother, I said. She's the one who told me to. Something moved across his face, grief and gratitude, and something that might have been relief, all arriving at once and too large for his expression to fully contain. He nodded once, got in the truck, and pulled out of the parking lot onto the road that ran back toward Putnam Avenue and the town that had once been the only life I knew. I watched until the truck disappeared past the first bend in the trees, the red taillights blinking once at the turn and then gone. Then I turned back toward the iron gate one last time. The robin had gone quiet. The morning had settled into itself, warm and unhurried, and Eleanor's white roses were still bright against the gray granite of her headstone, clean and simple and honest, exactly as she had always said they should be. I'm going home, Eleanor, I said quietly to no one, or perhaps to someone. And I meant it, without any weight at all. If you stayed with me this far, you already know how it ends, not with everything restored, but with something quieter. A man at a cemetery gate in April, finally ready to go home. I am 60 years old. I spent most of those years believing love alone was enough to protect the people you built a life with. It isn't. Don't make my mistake. Protect what you've built in writing before you ever need to. I won't pretend to have all the answers. But I'll say this, once there was a moment in that Portland kitchen, sitting alone with Eleanor's handwriting in my hands, when I finally understood what God had been trying to show me all along, that sometimes a door has to close hard before you find the one that was meant for you. Eleanor's name is still above the door. The bread is still baking. Some things are worth building twice. If Raymond's story stayed with you, leave a comment. Your words reach further than you know. Share this with someone who needs to hear it today, and subscribe so you never miss what comes next. A note. The stories ahead contain fictional elements built for the purpose of exploring real human experiences. If that's not for you, no hard feelings. Step away and find what serves you better. Thank you truly for staying until the end.